Psalm 81. Be 81, Psalm 81 this morning, this evening. And 16 verses long, and again, a lot of history. So these last few Psalms have really been about specific times in Israel's history, referring to specific events, and it's been kind of neat that way to look back and be able to see those connections. But you have here, starting in Psalm 81, the first 7 verses I've outlined as reasons for celebration, reasons to celebrate. First 7 verses. It says, "Sing aloud unto God our strength. Make a joyful noise unto the God of Jacob. Take a psalm and bring hither the timbrel, the pleasant harp with a psaltery. Blow up the trumpet in the new moon, in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Israel, and a law of the God of Jacob." This he ordained, in Joseph for a testimony when he went out through the land of Egypt, where I heard a language that I understood not. I removed his shoulder from the burden, his hands were delivered from the pots. Thou callest in trouble, and I delivered thee. I answered thee in the secret place of thunder. I proved thee in the waters of Meribah. Selah. First 7 verses there. So you have right away a command really to sing unto the Lord, the God of our strength, make a joyful noise unto the God of Jacob. And that's a verse we can see. We could trace that verse back to several Psalms. Several Psalms open up this way when it's referring to whether it's an entire psalm about praise. It's a common phrase there. But then you have verses 2 and 3 saying specifically, this is how you do it. Take certain instruments. Take a psalm, which would have been, one of these, of course, as we study these are meant to be sung. The Hebrew people would have sang these songs, whether it was David writing them. In this case, it's Asaph. They would actually put these to music and sung them. So it'd be kind of neat to see how those would have sounded. It'd be beautiful, I'm sure. Bring the timbrel, the pleasant harp, the psaltery, and then a trumpet. And so you have 4 different instruments listed there. Just bring your instrument. I don't play anything, but there's my wife likes to do like jam sessions. We all come together, just thrown in with something, whether it's a piano, a guitar, and just play. And it is if it's in the right heart attitude, it can be a very joyous time. So that's it. The attitude here is just let's all come together and sing and praise the Lord. Then in verse 3, it speaks of a very specific time. So it seems like this is calling Israel to a very specific event. It says, blow the trumpet in the new moon. That's this very set time. It's a specific time during the month, in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. And we know, and I don't know how many feast days throughout the Hebrew calendar you would have, but if you remember back in the book of Nehemiah, and it was Nehemiah, I think 7 and 8 is where it started, where Israel came together and said, hey, we want to hear the law. And they read it and they said, wow, this is the 7th month. This is our 7th month in our Hebrew calendar. It's the month of Tishrei, and there's 3 feasts that land on that 7th month. And so that month is just full of celebration. And so this particular event, blowing the trumpet on the new moon, was an event known as, well, it would have been the feast day of trumpets. It would have been what the Jews would celebrate today as Rosh Hashanah. And so it falls between our September and middle October is where that month would be today. But Rosh Hashanah, it's talking about the Feast of Trumpets. Leviticus 23, 24 through 25 gives the details to that. You have that Feast of Trumpets, you blow the trumpets, you remember what God has done, and you're building up basically a history of reminding yourself of what God has done as the Redeemer. And then you have, in the middle of that month, you have Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. That's the big day where the entire nation gets basically forgiven. The high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, sprinkle the blood, and say, God, forgive me of my sins, and cleanse the entire nation. So Feast of Trumpets were kind of like that very, very first one to kind of get the whole month started. And then you also had the Feast of Tabernacles, when they would make booths in their backyards. Well, even today they do that. They make booths in their backyards. They sleep back there for a day, remembering what God did for his people as they wandered through the wilderness. But that's what Nehemiah in their story, they're in Nehemiah 7 and 8. That's when they made the booths. It was all in that same month. So lots of stuff happening in that month. But specifically here, trumpet in the new moon, blowing the trumpet in the new moon, solemn feast day. This is Rosh Hashanah. This is the Feast of Trumpets. Verse 4, but this is a statute for Israel and a law of the God of Jacob. So remember this, guys. Go back to it. This could have been, and I can't say for sure that this could have been a post-exile psalm when everyone's coming back and they're just learning again, hey, it's been a few generations back since we started doing this regularly. It's been a long time. We've been in another country. We haven't had necessarily the law sitting right before us. We haven't had it read in the synagogues like we used to. This is new. We got to get back to this. And so this psalm could have been as part of that kind of awakening process. Let's get back to what God had told us to do. Verse 5, for he ordained in Joseph for a testimony. Now, the very first time this Feast of Trumpets is mentioned is in Leviticus. Joseph is dead. Joseph is already gone. He died in Egypt. They were bringing back his bones. They were bringing back his mummified remains, as far as we know, bringing him to the Promised Land. But here specifically, it's not Joseph. It's not Joseph anymore. I should probably grab tissue really fast. But grab this. Oops. But like we saw even last time, Joseph is such a prominent character as the Redeemer that it's likely that that group would have still been called by Joseph's name. Later, Judah would be more of a prominent name at that point. He ordained it in Joseph for a testimony when he went through the land of Egypt, where I heard a language that I understood not. And the idea there is as the Jew is remembering, this is where and really as a nation, they're a young nation. This is the very first time that as a nation they really struggled with oppression. I mean, this was the very first exile they had, or being under bondage in Egypt. It was intense. They were slaves. It had been 400 years. It was a long time. And so the Jew would have wandered through there and realized there's a language around here I don't understand. And that's speaking of the Egyptian language. After a while, you probably learned a lot of what they were trying to say to you and stuff, but the Jewish people did stay separate. They needed to be. They were slaves, but yet God had told them as a nation, you need to stay within your clan. You need to stay within your tribes, or stay within the nation. You don't mix with the Egyptians. And so there was the very big distinction. Here we are. This is where we live. Our Egyptian masters live over here. And so the language barrier would have still been very intense, and the Jews would have just seen that. That's just another example. We hear this language every day, and it represents we're not in our homeland. We're not where we belong. Verse 6, I removed his shoulder. This is God speaking of how he freed them from slavery. He removed his shoulder from the burden. His hands were delivered from the pots. They didn't have to mold clay anymore. They didn't have to work on making bricks to build the different temples and monuments that the pharaohs would have wanted them to build. They didn't have to carry the heavy burdens on their shoulders any longer. Literally freed physically from the burden of slavery. Verse 7, thou callest in trouble, and I deliver thee. I answer thee in the secret place. The secret place of thunder, I'm sorry. And so, again, just rehearsing history, they did cry out. And that's exactly what the book of Exodus says, that God heard their cries. He heard his people crying, went to Moses and said, I've heard them. This is now I'm responding. I'm calling you as the Redeemer, or as the deliverer. Go back and bring them out. And so same, and just very, almost word for word there again. You called in trouble. You're in the middle of the struggle. I came, delivered you. I answered thee in the secret place of thunder. And that phrase, in the secret place of thunder, literally means a covering or a covering place in the midst of a storm, is what that word means in the original, and it would have been Hebrew in this case. So as everything is raging and crashing around you, the storm is literally right there, the wind is blowing, there's lightning everywhere, I'm going to cover you up, and you're safe there. You're safe with me. Kind of like same picture of a bird covering, a mother bird covering her eggs, covering her young. Just almost that natural expression you see earlier in other psalms that explains it that way. That's the idea there. In the midst of a difficult place, sometimes it's described as a cleft in the rock, crawling into a tight spot between two big rocks, or in the middle of a small crack in a canyon or something. Just a safe place where you stay dry. The wind can't get you there. That's the idea there. I answered you, and I placed you in this secure area. I proved thee in the waters of Meribah. This is another reference to Israel's history, but kind of a sad one. In Exodus 17:1 is when, and just another time, and really there's you can't say this. I know specifically this particular incident because Israel did a lot of fighting with God. They did a lot of murmuring. They did a lot of complaining, and we probably wouldn't be no better really. But this particular incident, They actually named the place, this is the place of quarreling, just because Israel did it so intensely, and it was so bitter, and it was such a struggle between Moses and God's people, that God said, you know what, I'm going to give you the sweet water you want. I'm going to bring you water out of a rock. But you also have to realize I'm going to label this place as place of quarreling because it was so bad. I want you to remember that. When your children come back to this area, you remember this place. Geographically, this is where you fought with me. And so Meribah means to quarrel with God. So we have reasons for celebrating. Now we have the last 8 verses are more very sad. It's called the lament. I label it as the lamenting of a grieving father. God looks at Israel as a father would look at a child. Just the emotions that are expressed here from a spirit, the God who is a spirit, but you can almost see the paternal aspect of the love that he has for his people here. Verse 8, "Hear, O my people, and I will testify unto thee. O Israel, if thou wilt hearken unto me. There shall no strange God be in thee, neither shalt thou worship any strange God. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it." Kind of just setting the stage. This is what I told you. And really, we've seen this in the Ten Commandments. The mention specifically of no strange God is it's a command that's always been there, but it's one that Israel has really struggled with. That has been one that they have really messed up on. Whether it was Solomon, the smartest, wisest king that probably ever exists or ever will exist. At the very end, he had so many wives, and every single wife was more part of a political move. But she'd say, "Hey, can you build a temple for me? I have this one God I like. He's kind of my patron God. Can you build it for me? And then, hey, can you come worship with me?" And he would do that. In his old age, this wise man would fall to that level, and it was so sad. And that led, unfortunately, to later the division of the entire nation because of what David, his father, had done. And so we're not perfect. We're not, none of us are perfect, but you see the issue of foreign gods being brought in was such a hard thing to do. And even, I think we mentioned this before, even coming out of Egypt. You would think as slaves they would be just despising the Egyptian culture. And even as slaves they said, "I remember there was a God and he looked like this. And you know what? Just for the heck of it, let's sacrifice to him out here in the field." You're out in the middle of nowhere, out in the wilderness. God's brought you out here. God's provided everything for you up to this point. He's given you food, water. He's provided meat for you. He's kept your sandals from wearing out. And you decide to sacrifice to some half eagle, half man God because, I remember him and he looked kind of cool. It was just, but so constantly Israel's been fighting this, whether it's basically spiritual immorality, dealing with this strange gods and not worshiping the one true God. So he brings it up again. And he reminds them what he's done. He reminds them again, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't you know how significant that is? Even the Red Sea crossing. Amazing, guys. You should be just, that should just be so burned into your minds that you're not going to go back to you're not going to wish to go back to slavery. You're not going to wish to go back to these foreign gods. In the promise, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. Accept those provisions, those literal physical provisions I offer to you. And I have to mention that there's just even taking it back taking it up to current times as Christians today. That's exactly the same attitude God has today. Open your mouth wide. I want to fill it. You got your words sitting right before you. I was talking to the kids on Sunday, and we were just I forget where we were going with it, but I said, we have God's word, and I said in some countries you can't have God's word open up like this and studying it in a downstairs room with a big name church on the front and because really there's countries like that, and it just blows your mind that in some places you can't do this, but we do. We have access to this, so it's really easy for us to open our mouths wide and be filled spiritually and to be blessed by what God's doing. Verse 11, "But my people," so this is what God wants to do. This is God's heart. "But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me." And I would almost say in modern times that Israel did not want to have none of God. They didn't want to have anything to do with God. They didn't want him around. They didn't want his commands. I think they sure wanted his protection sometimes. They sure wanted physical provision at sometimes. But at this point, they didn't want anything from God. They didn't want their the remembrance of his statutes. I mean, even at the very end, before Israel goes into captivity again with the Babylonians, the spiritual immorality was so intense that the priests that were supposed to be guiding the people, that were supposed to be looking at the Old Testament and say, hey, these are the promises God made, we're wandering off. They didn't even understand. Their eyes were so blinded that spiritually they were running in the dark without their lights on, basically blindfolded. And it was just such a terrible time. So Israel truly did not want to have anything to do with their God. Verse 12, so I gave them up unto their own hearts, unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. Verse 12 again, so I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. And that is mankind. Mankind will always, always, always do that. That is just, I think of, and I mentioned this before, Romans 1:24 says the almost exact same thing. God gave them up. That same phrase is there again. God, and this is in Hebrew. Romans would have been in, that Roman passage would have been in Greek, but interesting to see the relation, if those two words are very similar, if those would be, connected in some way. Just the attitude of that's part of God's will, is at some point saying, I give you up. You have gone so off track as a nation, as a world. In Romans 1:24, it doesn't speak specifically to the Jews, it's talking about everybody. I made a beautiful world for you to live in. I made everything you would ever want. I even made it a perfect world from Adam and Eve, and they chose, you know what, this serpent guy that's talking to us in this tree that we've never seen before, he sounds pretty smart, we'll go his way, And they didn't thank God for what they had, they didn't acknowledge what he did for them, and he gave them up. He let them go down the path of sin. And Romans 1 ends badly, and this is sad as well. So he gives the nation up. He lets them go. He lets them pursue after their own heart's lusts. Again, not always sensual, just flat out, it's selfishness. Flat out, I want to do my own way. Verse 13, oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. That's the emotion you see here. God, oh my, I didn't want to give up. I wish they would have listened. I wish they would listen to me. I should soon have subdued their enemies and turned my hand against their adversaries. I could have protected them. I could have helped them win over these oppressors that wanted to put them under bondage and make them slaves. I could have provided for them, given them the power to win. Verse 15, the haters of the Lord should have submitted themselves unto me, but their time should have endured forever. And the grammar there is different in how we would word things in English. But the idea there is, I could have let this nation live in freedom for many, many years, many generations. They could have been. But these haters, these ones that hated the Lord, they chose not to submit. They were so stiff-necked and so against everything God was trying to do and what God was trying to do in their own personal lives that they pushed back until God said, okay, I'll let you go. I'll let you, if you are so against what my purposes are for this nation, I would just let you go. Now again, and we'll get to the end here fairly soon, but this psalm has really it doesn't have even a glimmer of hope in the future, like other psalms we've looked at where it's like, it's bad now, but God's going to provide, Christ is going to come later, the Messiah is going to come later. We see that in all the rest of the counsel, the entire counsel of God, so we know what the end is going to look like. But this ends on a really sad note, and it shouldn't get us down because we know the ending. But the idea there is just for some Israelites, they died in bondage. I mean, think about that. There were some that were so much like see here as haters of God, and they died in Babylon. They never got to see the temple again. They never got to see a spiritually healthy nation of Israel again. They never did. I mean, because of their actions, because of as leaders or parents of a home or runners, running a business, whatever it might have been, their part led to the spiritual demise of an entire nation, and eventually the physical bondage of a nation. And it ended in bondage for them. It was very sad. And so, so we see in verse 15, the haters should have submitted. Verse 16, he should have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey out of a rock should I have satisfied thee. And so the idea there, again, rereading verse 16, we see should. In our English, we maybe would have used the word like could. He could have done this, speaking to God. His desire was not just to provide for the needs. He wanted to provide for them richly. I think it's Family Life Today's ministry. I believe it says we don't want to just let families, we don't want to just see family, their ministry, their mission is we don't want to just see families survive. We want to see them thrive. And that's the idea. That's the idea with God. That's the way He wants with us. And with Israel, it's always been this way. I don't want to just sustain you. I don't want to just give you the water you need to survive today, provide manna for the next day and all this. I want you to thrive. I want you to be a big, strong nation. Remember that map of where they should have dwelt as a nation, or those boundaries they should have had? They never got that. They never expanded and said, we're going to go beyond the Jordan and even into this area and continue to fight and continue to bring down and take on these promises God has provided. They never did that. They never completely did that. And yet God's promise here is, I could have done all that for you. If you just submitted to me. And that's the key, is you have the word submit, and then you have, up in verse 12, the heart of lust. Those two do not get along. The clash of, I will yield my lusts, I will yield my desires over to God and say, I'm not going to do those. God might never allow me to fulfill what my lusts, whatever they might be. He's never going to allow me to fulfill that in a righteous context. And that's okay, because that's wrong. I don't want to do that. That's against God's glory. It's against God's will. And I will submit. And so it's hard. I don't say it's easy, but as an entire nation, they did that. Spiritually, they were blinded. Immorally, spiritually, immorality was throughout the entire nation. But they had a history they could look back on. And God, thankfully, again, we know the end. God did great things with Nehemiah. He brought redemption through Esther there in Medo-Persia. So many other things God continued to do for His nation. But the emotion there is neat to see as well. I could have done so much. I wish my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. So, the grieving heart of a father, for sure. And we've seen that last week, I guess, was the picture of Israel as a plant. We've seen Israel described as children, as little babies that God has raised and brought up. So He truly loves them. He truly loves us. And when I think about that every day, for me personally, and I think of my own the battle I have with my own personal lusts and my own personal desires and putting selfish intentions away, and I think of the context of, I'm one piece of a local body here. I'm not the nation of Israel, but I'm one piece. If I turn and God says, you know what, you're not listening to me, you're not obeying, you're spending all your days seeking after this shiny thing over here, not my will. How's that going to affect all the rest of us? And not necessarily all us, and not, I think of myself as well and my own personal struggles. But does God have that same feeling for us that, I wish Daniel would listen. I wish, put yourself in that situation. I wish he would listen. I wish he would listen. I wish he would respond. That changes. That changes a lot when you think about God in that context, because He does know those things. He has the exact same emotions for us as well. So, any other thoughts or additions to that?